Russia is a land of contradictions, a vast and complex nation whose history casts a long shadow over the modern world. Its story is one of great triumphs and immense suffering, of brilliant culture and brutal autocracy. To understand the global events of today, from energy politics in Europe to conflicts in the Middle East, we must first look to Russia's past. The decisions made by its rulers centuries ago, the scars left by invasions, and the dreams of its people continue to shape its actions on the world stage. This enduring legacy is why Russia remains a subject of intense debate and controversy, a power that cannot be ignored. Its history is not just a story of one country, it is a vital part of the story of our interconnected world. The origins of the Russian state are found in a medieval federation known as Kievan Rus. Centered in modern-day Kiev, this collection of Slavic peoples thrived from the 9th to the 13th centuries, developing a unique culture and adopting Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire. This religious and cultural connection would become a cornerstone of Russian identity for centuries to come, creating a sense of a distinct civilization separate from Western Europe. The early Rus princes established trade routes and a legal code, laying the groundwork for a future state. However, this promising beginning was violently interrupted, altering the course of Russian history forever and honestly instilling a deep-seated vulnerability to outside threats. This interruption came in the form of the Mongol invasion in the mid-13th century. The Golden Horde swept across the plains, destroying cities including Kiev and subjugating the Rus principalities for over 2 centuries. This period, often called the Mongol yoke, had a profound and lasting impact. It isolated Russia from the major cultural and scientific developments happening in Europe, such as the Renaissance. The Mongol system of rule, based on absolute authority and tribute collection, also reinforced a model of centralized autocratic power. The struggle to throw off this yoke fostered a powerful sense of national unity, but it was a unity forged in hardship and oriented around a strong single ruler. While Kievan Rus was shattered, the northern principality of Moscow gradually grew in strength and influence. The princes of Moscow positioned themselves as the primary collectors of tribute for the Mongols, which allowed them to consolidate power and wealth. Over time, they led the resistance against the Golden Horde, culminating in a final victory that established Moscow as the new center of a unified Russian state. This shift from Kiev to Moscow was not just a geographic one. It signified the beginning of a more centralized and authoritarian political tradition. The legacy of the Mongol era, a fear of invasion, a belief in the necessity of a powerful central government, and a sense of destiny to defend its lands, would become a recurring theme throughout Russia's history. With the Mongol yoke broken, the Grand Princes of Moscow began to consolidate their power and expand their territory, laying the foundations for the Tsardom of Russia. The most formidable of these early rulers was Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Crowned in 1547 as the first Tsar or Caesar of all Russia, his reign was a study in contrasts. He modernized the army, reformed the government, and commissioned the construction of magnificent buildings like St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. He sought to create a powerful, centralized state capable of defending its borders and projecting its influence. His vision was of a Holy Russian Empire, the spiritual successor to Rome and Constantinople. However, Ivan's reign is more famously remembered for its descent into paranoia and brutality. He created the Oprichnina, a state within a state administered by his black-clad secret police who terrorized the Russian nobility and common people alike. This campaign of purges, public executions, and land confiscations was designed to crush any potential opposition to his absolute rule. This period of terror left deep scars on the Russian psyche, cementing the idea that the state's power was absolute and that its interests superseded the rights of individuals. Ivan's legacy is complex. He was both a nation builder and a tyrant, establishing a model of autocratic rule that would be emulated by his successors for centuries. Following Ivan's death, Russia endured a period of civil war and foreign invasion known as the Time of Troubles. Yet, from this chaos, the nation emerged with a new dynasty, the Romanovs, who would rule for over 300 years. During the 17th century, under their rule, Russia began an astonishing eastward expansion across the vast, sparsely populated lands of Siberia. Driven by the lucrative fur trade, hardy explorers and Cossack adventurers pushed ever further, reaching the Pacific Ocean by the mid-1600s. This expansion transformed Russia into the largest country on Earth, a sprawling empire spanning 2 continents. This immense size would become a defining feature of Russia, presenting both great opportunities and immense challenges for governance and defense. This period of consolidation and expansion set the stage for one of Russia's most transformative leaders, Peter the Great. Ascending to the throne at the end of the 17th century, Peter was determined to modernize Russia and turn it into a major European power. He traveled extensively in Western Europe, studying shipbuilding, military organization, and administration. Upon his return, he initiated a sweeping series of reforms with, honestly, ruthless energy. He built a modern army and navy, reorganized the government, and introduced new technologies. He even forced the nobility to adopt Western European customs, famously ordering them to shave their beards and wear Western-style clothing, symbolizing a dramatic break with the old Muscovite traditions. Peter the Great's reforms were not merely cosmetic, they were a fundamental reorientation of Russia towards the West. His ultimate goal was to secure a window on Europe, a warm water port that would allow Russia to trade and interact directly with the major European powers. To achieve this, he waged a long and costly war against Sweden, eventually gaining control of the Baltic coastline. On this newly conquered land, he founded a new capital city, St. Petersburg. Built by conscripted serfs in a grand European style, it stood as a powerful symbol of his ambition. The city was a testament to his will, a declaration that Russia was no longer a peripheral state, but a key player in European politics. The social and political costs of Peter's modernization were immense. The reforms were imposed from the top down with an iron fist, increasing the power of the state and the burden on the common people. The construction of St. Petersburg and the new navy required massive taxes and forced labor, leading to tens of thousands of deaths. While he sought to create a more efficient and meritocratic bureaucracy, he also strengthened the institution of serfdom, tying peasants more tightly to the land and the nobility who served his state. Peter's revolution was one of state building, not of social liberation. He created a powerful empire but also deepened the chasm between the westernized elite and the traditional, long-suffering Russian peasantry. The momentum of westernization continued under Catherine the Great in the late 18th century. A German princess who came to power through a palace coup, Catherine embraced the ideas of the European Enlightenment, corresponding with philosophers like Voltaire. She promoted arts and sciences, established new schools, and sought to reform Russia's legal code. Her reign is often considered a golden age of the Russian Empire, a time when its cultural and political influence in Europe reached a new peak. She expanded the empire's borders significantly, annexing the Crimean Khanate and absorbing large parts of Poland, bringing millions of new subjects under Russian rule. Despite her enlightened rhetoric, Catherine's policies also served to strengthen the autocracy and the institution of serfdom. A massive peasant rebellion led by Yemelyan Pugachev, which threatened the very foundations of her state, convinced her to abandon any thoughts of social reform. Instead, she granted the nobility even greater power over their serfs in exchange for their loyal service to the crown. This golden age for the Russian aristocracy was built upon the misery of the vast majority of the population. The deep social inequalities that solidified under Catherine would create tensions that would simmer for more than a century before finally exploding into revolution. The power of the Russian Empire was put to the test in the early 19th century when Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, launched his fateful invasion of Russia in 1812. Napoleon's Grand Army, the largest European military force ever assembled at that time, marched on Moscow. The Russians, under the command of Mikhail Kutuzov, employed a scorched earth strategy, retreating deep into the country and destroying supplies. Though Napoleon captured a burning Moscow, he found himself trapped by the brutal Russian winter with no way to feed his troops. The subsequent retreat was a disaster, destroying his army and marking the beginning of his downfall. This victory over Napoleon elevated Russia's status to that of a major European superpower. The triumph of 1812, however, masked deep-seated problems within Russian society. Many Russian officers who had marched to Paris and witnessed a more liberal way of life returned home with new ideas about freedom and constitutional government. They were deeply troubled by the backwardness of their own country, particularly the morally corrosive institution of serfdom, which kept the majority of the population in a state of bondage. This discontent led to the Decembrist Revolt of 1825. a failed attempt by a group of army officers to establish a constitutional monarchy. The revolt was ruthlessly crushed by the new Tsar, Nicholas I, who responded by creating a repressive police state to stamp out any liberal ideas. Throughout the 19th century, the so-called cursed questions of Russia's future, autocracy, serfdom, and backwardness, dominated intellectual life. Debates raged between Westernizers who believed Russia must follow the European path of development and Slavophiles who argued that Russia had its own unique spiritual path based on Orthodox faith and peasant community. While the intellectuals debated, the country was slowly changing. The Crimean War of the 1850s exposed Russia's military and industrial weakness compared to Britain and France. This humiliating defeat spurred Tsar Alexander II to enact a series of great reforms, the most significant of which was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. While the emancipation was a monumental step, it was deeply flawed. The freed peasants were burdened with heavy redemption payments for the land they received, which was often not enough to support their families. This led to widespread rural poverty and discontent, fueling the growth of revolutionary movements. Radical groups, frustrated with the slow pace of change, turned to terrorism, culminating in the assassination of Alexander II in 1881. His successors, Alexander III and Nicholas II, reacted by reversing many of the reforms and imposing a harsh policy of Russification on the empire's ethnic minorities. This era of reaction and repression only drove the opposition underground, setting the stage for the catastrophic upheavals of the early 20th century. The early 20th century brought Russia's internal crises to a breaking point. The country's rapid but uneven industrialization created a new, highly concentrated urban working class that was subject to terrible living and working conditions. Defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 shattered the myth of the Tsar's military might and ignited widespread unrest. In January 1905, a peaceful demonstration of workers in St. Petersburg was fired upon by soldiers, an event that became known as Bloody Sunday. This massacre destroyed the people's centuries-old faith in the Tsar as a benevolent father figure and triggered a nationwide revolution. Strikes, peasant uprisings, and military mutinies forced Tsar Nicholas II to grant a constitution and create a parliament, the Duma. However, the Tsar's concessions were half-hearted. He repeatedly dissolved the Duma when it challenged his authority, and meaningful reform stalled. Russia's entry into World War I in 1914 proved to be the final, fatal blow to the Romanov dynasty. The war was a disaster for Russia, leading to millions of casualties, severe food shortages, and a complete breakdown of the economy. The Tsar's incompetent leadership and the influence of the mystic Rasputin at court discredited the monarchy entirely. In February 1917, food riots in the capital, now named Petrograd, quickly escalated into a full-scale revolution. The soldiers refused to fire on the crowds, the government collapsed, and Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The fall of the Tsar left a power vacuum. A weak provisional government attempted to continue the war and establish a democracy, but it lacked popular support. Meanwhile, radical socialist councils, known as Soviets, sprang up across the country. It was into this chaotic situation that Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the radical Bolshevik Party, returned from exile. With simple but powerful slogans like peace, land, and bread, Lenin and the Bolsheviks promised to end the war, give land to the peasants, and transfer all power to the Soviets. In October 1917, they seized power in a swift and well-organized coup, toppling the provisional government and establishing the world's first communist state. The Bolshevik victory plunged Russia into a brutal civil war that lasted for several years, pitting their Red Army against a collection of anti-communist forces known as the Whites, who were supported by foreign powers. After Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin rose to become the undisputed dictator of the newly formed Soviet Union. Stalin launched a ruthless program of forced industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. He transformed the USSR into a major industrial power, but at a horrific human cost. Millions perished from famine, forced labor in the Gulag prison camps, and the political purges of the Great Terror in the 1930s. Stalin forged a totalitarian state that controlled every aspect of life, a legacy of power and fear that would endure for decades. The Soviet Union's ordeal in World War II, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, was a defining national experience. The surprise Nazi invasion in 1941 brought the country to the brink of collapse. Yet despite suffering staggering losses, estimated at over 27 million military and civilian deaths, the Soviet people rallied. Through immense sacrifice and brutal determination, the Red Army pushed the German forces back from the gates of Moscow and Stalingrad all the way to Berlin. This victory came at an unimaginable cost, but secured the USSR's status as one of the world's two superpowers, alongside the United States. The war left Russia with a profound sense of pride in its victory, but also a deep-seated fear of invasion. The end of the war did not bring peace, but rather the beginning of a new global conflict, the Cold War. As the Soviet Union installed communist regimes in the Eastern European countries it had liberated, Winston Churchill famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The world became polarized into two hostile camps, one led by the capitalist United States and the other by the communist Soviet Union. This ideological struggle was fought not on a direct battlefield between the two superpowers, but through proxy wars, espionage, and an intense propaganda battle for influence over the hearts and minds of people across the globe. A central feature of the Cold War was the terrifying arms race. Both the US and the USSR developed vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, creating a doctrine of mutually assured destruction, where a nuclear attack by one side would guarantee the total annihilation of both. This constant threat of global apocalypse shaped international politics for decades. The rivalry also extended into science and technology, most famously in the space race. The Soviet launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in 1957, was a huge shock to the West and spurred the United States to ramp up its own space program, leading eventually to the moon landing. For a time, the USSR appeared to be a genuine technological and ideological competitor to the West. Within the Soviet bloc, however, life was defined by repression and conformity. The state controlled the economy, the media, and all forms of cultural expression. The KGB, the state security agency, suppressed any form of dissent. While the system provided a basic level of social security, such as guaranteed employment and free healthcare, it came at the cost of individual freedom and economic dynamism. The Soviet economy, burdened by massive military spending and centralized planning, began to stagnate. The desire for national independence and personal liberty continued to simmer beneath the surface in Eastern Europe and within the USSR itself, setting the stage for the eventual collapse of the entire system. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing a deep crisis. Its stagnant economy could no longer keep up with the West, and the disastrous war in Afghanistan was draining its resources and morale. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power and initiated radical reforms known as glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. He intended to revitalize the communist system, but his reforms unintentionally unleashed forces he could not control. Glasnost allowed for open criticism of the government and the country's past, while perestroika's economic changes created instability. Encouraged by this new openness, nationalist movements gained strength across the Soviet republics, and the countries of Eastern Europe began to break away from Moscow's control in 1989. The collapse came swiftly. An attempted coup by hardline communists in August 1991 failed, but it fatally weakened Gorbachev's authority and accelerated the breakup of the country. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union had officially dissolved, and its constituent republics, including Russia, became independent states. The 1990s were a traumatic and chaotic period for Russia under its first president, Boris Yeltsin. The rapid shift to a market economy, known as shock therapy, led to hyperinflation, economic collapse, and a dramatic fall in living standards for most of the population. A small group of well-connected individuals, the so-called oligarchs, became fantastically wealthy by acquiring state assets, creating a society of vast inequality. This period of national humiliation and economic hardship created a strong public desire for order, stability, and a restoration of national pride. It was in this context that Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, rose to power at the end of 1999. Putin moved quickly to re-establish strong central control, curbing the power of the oligarchs, reining in the media, and cracking down on political opposition. He oversaw a period of economic recovery, largely fueled by rising prices for Russia's oil and gas exports. Many Russians credited him with saving the country from the chaos of the 1990s and restoring Russia's status as a major power on the world stage. This restored confidence has translated into a more assertive and often confrontational foreign policy. Putin's Russia has sought to re-establish its influence in the near abroad, the former Soviet republics it considers part of its historical sphere of interest. This has led to actions such as the brutal war in Chechnya, the 2008 war with Georgia, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. These actions are driven by a long-standing historical narrative, a belief that Russia is a great power with a unique destiny, a deep-seated suspicion of the West, and a conviction that a strong, centralized state is necessary to protect the nation from external threats and internal chaos. Russia's past is not just history. It is a living force that continues to shape our world's future.